The College Football Playoff Committee has spoken. Alabama liked what they had to say. Florida State did not. 13-0 was not enough to get Florida State into the College Football Playoff. Alabama's upset of Georgia in the SEC Championship gave them the catapult they needed to get to the 4 seed, and so the field is set. And, of course, there's a lot of folks not happy about it. Welcome into SEC Football Unfiltered, our podcast from the USA Today Network. I'm Blake Toppmeyer with John Adams. John, we're going to get into what we thought our 4 best teams were, which, by the way, spoiler alert, do not match the committee's 4 teams that they selected. But first, want to address the 4 teams that are in the field. I can't say I'm shocked, John, because Greg Sankey rules the sport. He is the galactic overlord of college football. He was politicking and peacocking his way around Saturday, acting like any playoff without the SEC would just be a complete sham and a waste of time. And what was probably left unsaid was, if he and the SEC didn't get their way, who knows what they might do. It was just a couple years ago, Greg Sankey was talking about the SEC staging its own playoff. Well, it didn't come to that because Sankey is the guy in charge here, and the committee serves at his feet, and Alabama's in. It doesn't sit well with me, John. I don't have any problem with what Alabama achieved this season. I think they deserve a lot of praise, a lot of credit for getting off the mat after their Week 2 loss to Texas. And in a normal year, I think Alabama would have done enough to get in the playoff, but this isn't a normal year. There are 3 undefeated Power 5 champions. I think those 3 teams played their way in. Yes, Jordan Travis got injured, the star quarterback for FSU. Florida State's been winning without him. Need defense to do it, but they're still winning. So I think those 3 13-0 should be in, and then it becomes a debate of Texas or Alabama. They're both 12-1. They're both conference champions. Texas won the head-to-head. I think Texas should have gotten the last spot and at the expense of Alabama. What say you?
Well, I do have a problem with the team doing what Florida State did, and then you say, well, you can't be in the playoff because your quarterback's out. Listening to the 500,000 ESPN talking heads during the course of Sunday afternoon, I liked what Dan Mullen said, and I'm hesitant to give too much credit to coaches or former coaches, but he talked about you watch a team play and you think that's the best team. But then what you think is the best team goes out and it loses a game. And Georgia-Alabama game, I thought Georgia was the best team. I still think if they played 7 times, Georgia would win the majority of the games, but Alabama, to its credit, won and deserves all the credit for that. But my point is, you just don't know until they play the game, and you can say, well, Florida State can't win without their quarterback. I don't know if that's true. I mean, I just don't. You just can't tell until they play the game. I think Florida State has a lot of strengths, a lot of balance, is good at a lot of areas. Yeah, it probably wouldn't do as well. I wouldn't expect it to. I would certainly, if it played Alabama, I would favor Alabama. But the main thing that impressed me about the selection process, not just this year, but in the past too, is it's almost the committee picks its teams, and we've talked about this off air. The committee picks its teams, and it tells you why. Here's the criteria we use to pick that team and put it there.
Yeah, the goalposts always seem to move.
Yeah, and then they're way over here. And then they go far east and say, well, we put this team third because of this, and we left this team out because of that. And so there's a lot of hypocrisy going on and a lot of contradictory selections with this process.
The one that just took the cake for me, John, that is just like, what are we even doing here? Like, you're better off saying nothing than this answer. Boo Corrigan, the playoff selection committee chair on ESPN, said, well, we had the conversation about who would a team not want to play in the playoff. That's the first time I ever heard that criterion. I asked Boo about that. I mentioned that I didn't see that anywhere in the playoff selection rules. And Boo said, "Well, no, it's not a rule, but that's just a conversation we had." And I never heard that mentioned before. And frankly, if that's the standard for determining the playoff teams, well, just go ahead and start the year with Alabama, Georgia, and Ohio State in the playoff. Because if you poll coaches about who they don't want to face, I feel pretty strongly that those three teams annually are going to be kind of at the head of that conversation, given all the NFL level talent those teams perennially possess. So, yeah, if you're going to do it for play that standard, why stop at Alabama? You know, just run it on down the line. Who would you rather face, Washington or Georgia? If we're being honest here, I think a lot of coaches would say they'd rather face Washington. Okay, Georgia's in. Would you rather face Texas or Ohio State, right? I mean, that's the problem with these arguments. And as you said with Dan Mullen pointing out, that's the problem with who are the quote unquote best teams. Well, the crystal ball can be pretty hazy, and it's been pretty hazy this season. Alabama was a touchdown favorite in Tuscaloosa, lost to Texas. Oregon, all the so-called pundits thought they were going to win the rematch against Washington. I guess that includes us. We thought Oregon would win the rematch with Washington. Well, Washington won. And so they played their way in. Florida State won all 13 times they stepped out on the field. Yes, they lost their star quarterback. Other teams have lost their quarterbacks before and gotten into the playoff. I think what it came down to, John, was push came to shove, and it was either leave the SEC out or leave out undefeated Florida State. And the committee was terrified at the thought of what might happen if they left the SEC out. I mean, you think the reaction from Mike Norvell and Florida State and a few Florida lawmakers was intense? Imagine the blowback from Greg Sankey, the mighty SEC, and Alabama if the SEC champ had been left out. I mean, it would dwarf this times 100, I think.
Yeah, and well, Georgia got left out. I mean, Georgia has a legitimate beef. And then again, it gets back to what we're talking about. Boo Corrigan, who looked like he was probably shepherded out there at gunpoint. Okay, here's what we decided. You got to go make sense of this to the national media, which I thought was very kind to him, very kind. And it's questioning on ESPN at least. So, yeah, again, you're talking about the four best teams. Do you really think then if that's the standard, why was Georgia behind Florida State? Do you really think Florida State would beat Georgia with its third string quarterback? You said Florida State can't make the playoff because it doesn't have its quarterback, but it can still be ahead of Georgia, even though it doesn't have its quarterback. I mean, what kind of sense does it make? So they just come up with these different criteria. And as you brought out, which team wouldn't you want to play? That's a very subjective question.
I mean, let's just put the teams into a simulator and spit out the champion. Why even bother to play the games? And that's part of the problem here is, right, for years, college football has always held up the sanctity of its regular season at the expense of its playoff, at the expense of its postseason. College football has never had the best postseason because they've valued the sanctity of the regular season results, and they've been determined to make the regular season matter. And that's the way it's always been up until this year when it came time to leave the SEC out of the playoff for the first time ever. They decided the regular season didn't matter so much anymore. Florida State's 13-0 record didn't matter so much. I think that's a dangerous game to play, though, when you confront the reality that the regular season doesn't matter anymore. That's a dangerous message, I think, to send to college football fans.
Well, let's put another school in Florida State's position. What if Alabama had been 13-0? Now, I know it plays probably a harder schedule than Florida State because it's in the SEC, but just for hypothetical purposes, if Alabama would have been 13-0, but Jalen Milroe had gone down with an injury. I mean,
and we've seen Alabama's backup quarterbacks.
Yeah, South Florida was hanging with it. It was a 17-3 game back in September. Yeah, so you know what you're getting there. What if Michigan What if Michigan, the number one team now, according to the committee, J.J. McCarthy goes down in a win over Ohio State? Do you really think Michigan would have been left out? I don't.
I don't either, because they make up the rules as they go. And one of the reasons we heard from Boo Corrigan as to why Florida State was left out, well, they didn't have much passing offense against Louisville. Well, first of all, Brock Glenn won't be the quarterback for Florida State on January 1st. The backup, Tate Rodemaker, will be back. And Rodemaker wasn't great, but he was better against Florida than Brock Glenn was against Louisville, and Florida State managed to win anyway. But number two, Michigan, remember what they did through the air against Penn State? Not a lot. They didn't even bother to throw the ball in the second half. They threw for 60 yards in that victory. So wait a second. Is winning with defense impressive, or is it not impressive? And to your point, if Georgia had gone out Saturday in Atlanta and won that game against Alabama in a defensive struggle, let's say 16-6, and Carson Beck would have got hurt in the process, broken his leg horrifically like Jordan Travis did, Georgia would have been in the playoff. Not only would they be in the playoff,
of course it would have.
They would have been one of the top 2 seeds. And it would be different to me, John. This isn't an anti-SEC take. You and I make our living covering this conference. And I think in most years, the SEC is the best conference. But I don't know that it is this year. The non-conference results would suggest otherwise. It has not been a banner year for the SEC. And it would also be different if Florida State was hiding behind some soft scheduling. Now, the ACC wasn't as strong as it's been in certain years this year either. Head-to-head, it had a winning record, though, against the SEC. Also, Florida State did the one thing we beg of these teams to do. They went out and scheduled real non-conference opponents. They beat LSU in a neutral site game in the opener. They go into the Swamp, beat Florida. They're 2-0 against the SEC. They're 11-0 against Power 5 opponents. I just have a hard time when a team does everything you ask of them and they suffer one injury and they have to start winning with defense. You're going to keep that team out that went out and scheduled 2 SEC teams, neither one of them at home, 11-0 against Power 5s in a year where the SEC is not at its strongest. Stinks for the SEC, would have stunk for Alabama, but I think they got this one wrong.
Well, when you start talking about injuries and who can't play and how that affects their status with the committee, it's a really slippery slope. What if you look at Georgia through the same lens and say, okay, Brock Bowers played, but he's clearly not 100% coming back from that injury. Ladd McConkey played, but he's had lower back problems. I think he had a leg injury too. He's not 100%. I mean, nobody's and Georgia lost its All-American linebacker. So where do you draw the line? If you lose your 2 starting safeties and they're good players, all conference caliber players, you lose both of them in a game. Well, does that drop you down a notch? See, the committee sets these criteria. They list it. And it sounds good until you actually apply it to a real life situation. And then it's like, oh, we didn't think about that. No, you didn't.
I'd have more respect for it, John, if they just admitted, you know what, guys, the SEC has an auto bid. We don't call it that, but we've all known they've always had an auto bid. So let's be real here. They automatically get a team. I'd have more respect for it if you just came out and admitted it.
They won't say that. The SEC's won 13 of the past 17 national championships. As a voter, don't you kind of have to think about that?
You're not supposed to, but they clearly do.
You're not supposed to, but how can you ignore it? Because all 17 times we've gone in. I mean, I can remember way back in 2006, you go into the it was BCS national championship game. It wasn't a playoff. It was one game. Ohio State, I think, was a 7-point favorite over Florida. I mean, Ohio State was held as one of the great teams of all time, and Florida just went out there and beat it to death, play after play. Uh, so you just you just don't know, and the I look at Georgia and say, okay, they get themselves in trouble. It'd be better if they just said no comment. Here are our 4 teams. We're not talking about it.
Yeah.
We're not taking any questions. These are 4. We did the best we could. Here's what we
See you
got.
later.
Yeah. Well,
We'll see you at the bar. We thought these would be good games to watch at the bar while we're sipping a couple of cold ones. We'll see you there. You
but
guys
they
order the wings.
but they throw Buchanan again. He gets they throw. I think, well, like, who wouldn't you want to play? Or
Yeah, I wouldn't want to play Georgia again. Why aren't they in the
good
playoff?
gosh.
Yeah, nah. We could go round and round on this. We're in agreement, John, that we think they got the field wrong. Whether you think they got it right or not, probably partially depends on your fandom. I know most Alabama fans I've heard from think that they should be in, and really, me saying I think they got the field wrong doesn't have the. It really is not a shot at Alabama. It's a tough situation, and I think the best thing to do would have been to leave out Alabama, because Alabama hasn't always looked like one of the 4 best teams. They did against LSU, they did against Georgia. There's been a lot of other times this year, as recently as the Iron Bowl, where they didn't look like one of the 4 best teams, but they did on Saturday in Atlanta. Georgia helped them out with that. Georgia picked a bad time to have a sloppy game. I mean, penalty backed them up before the missed field goal off the upright. They gift wrapped Alabama 3 points. Fortunate it wasn't more with the fumble on the end around inside the red zone. And I didn't think Georgia had a great game plan. I think Alabama deserved some credit for that, though. After that opening drive, Alabama's defense was rock solid. I thought that secondary was much tougher than anything Carson Beck's gone against this year. The tackling and dominance of Alabama's defensive line up front really altered that game. And Jalen Milroe wasn't great, John, but when he needed to make big plays, he stepped up time and again. There was that time in the 4th quarter on a 3rd down. He bought himself time in the pocket and then flicked a little completion. I mean, that was channeling Bryce Young right there. I know he's like 4 inches taller than Bryce, but that was a play we've seen Bryce Young make time and again. And then he closed it out with his legs. He made the big throws when he needed to. He made the big runs when he needed to. It was really a vintage Alabama performance in a lot of ways. Their defense was very sound. They didn't commit any turnovers, limited penalties, didn't hurt themselves, and they had a quarterback who made clutch plays when the moment called for it. We'd heard Nick Saban in the preseason kind of hint at wanting to get back to old school Alabama. I don't think Alabama is ever totally going to get back to old school Bama, but this did have some of the elements of like a throwback Bama performance when you start thinking about some of those boxes they checked.
Yeah, I agree. And when you look at Georgia, and won 29 straight games, you can't play 30 games and not have a few glitches along the way. Excuse me. And sometimes those occur at the most inopportune moments in the worst, very worst games. I thought the difference, what you cited with Jalen Milroe, that is what Stetson Bennett gave Georgia the past 2 seasons. Stetson Bennett had an ability, and it's not something you can coach or teach, of rising to the occasion, of making a play that's not scripted. When things break down, he could scramble for yardage, or he could make a pass you wouldn't expect him to make. He can do the unexpected. And Carson Beck's a better pure passer than Stetson Bennett. If you line up, if they go through a NFL combine, I think Carson Beck might surpass him. And I'm not knocking Stetson, because Stetson Bennett was drafted himself, and he is a good passer. But he had that rare quality that some players have, to rise to the occasion when the moment calls for it. And that's what Jalen Milroe did. He did it against Auburn with the Miraculous 4th and 31 pass. You were there
Hmm.
for that game. You saw him doing that, and then you saw him do it again. I thought that was the play of the game. The one you referred to was when he made that shovel pass. I mean, Tim Tebow used to make those kind of plays. These are the kind of plays that win championships. I think when you get into a playoff, and this was, let's face it, this was like a college football playoff game. You've got two really good teams here, and you need something extra. You can't just map it out, do all your preparations, all your analytics, and things go to form. You've got to have somebody make a play when you don't think a play's really there. And that's what Jalen Milroe did. Was his performance impeccable? No. But when the moment demanded it, he delivered. So that, to me, I mean, you go back to last year, Ohio State for most of that game against Georgia looked like the better team. CJ Stroud was the best quarterback. He's the best quarterback in the country on that day. And that was a great Ohio State team, better than this year's Ohio State team. But what happened in that fourth quarter? Stetson Bennett made plays. Uh, Georgia came back, won the game, and it couldn't do that against Alabama. And Alabama made the plays.
Yeah, this will be music to your ears, John, but you were right. I was wrong because it was a couple weeks
Oh, I
ago.
love hearing that.
Yeah, I knew you would. And I thought I maybe wasn't quite as effusive in the praise of Stetson Bennett as you were, but I was pretty close. I thought his performance, particularly last year, was really special. He was good the year before. He was great last year. And yet I was so impressed with Carson Beck through 12 weeks. I thought he's going to have a career that's going to surpass even Stetson Bennett. Now, Carson Beck still had a very good season. You know, I don't believe, as we record this, he's announced his plans, but I presume he comes back for one more year next year and gives another go and then heads off to the NFL. Maybe he wins a national championship next year. And I don't want to put it all on him, and I won't put it all on him. However, I think it kind of proves your point that you've been making about Stetson Bennett all along. Don't underestimate that, in the clutch moments, in the big game moments, what he could do that wasn't always quantifiable. You look down at the stat sheet and you see a 12-yard run by the quarterback. You got to see it, in the moment, in the context, to know exactly what it meant. And Georgia didn't have that, and it wasn't just from the quarterback spot. I didn't think when they needed to make big plays, they didn't. When Alabama needed to make the big plays, they did. And you add on to that, Georgia made some uncharacteristic mistakes. I agree with you. If they played this game, 7 times, I think Georgia would win 4 or 5 out of the 7. But kind of goes back to my point on Florida State. They didn't play the game 7 times, and the results have to matter. The results do matter. Alabama's your SEC champion. They ruled the conference for the moment, and the committee says they're going to the playoff. But I want to spend a few minutes, John, on this whole best team situation, because we've already unpacked and we don't need to rehash. We don't agree with the committee's 4 teams. However, I think any way you slice it, they got it wrong. Because even if we're applying the 4 best teams moniker, I don't know exactly what that means. It's a subjective label. But we all have our little rankings of who we think the best teams are. And I still think, even by that lens, they got it wrong. And so I'm curious, John, who you think your 4 best teams are, regardless of what the rankings say, regardless of who you think should have made the playoff. If we're just doing this on 4 best teams, who's the 4 best teams right now?
Well, this certainly goes against the grain. But I would have Texas, Alabama, uh, Georgia, and Washington.
Would you have
So
them
I'm
ranked
leaving out.
in that order that you just said? You had Texas 1, Alabama 2, Georgia 3, Washington 4, or would you reshuffle?
I would reshuffle. I would probably have. If I'm going strictly by best team, I would probably say Texas, number 1. But
And then
I think
Georgia
that's
2?
the best team,
Yeah.
and Georgia. Uh, Washington, Alabama could go either way on that. I mean, I think, yeah, I'm leaving out the number one seed, but I think a lot of this is image, and it gets back to what Dan Mullen says. We watch a team and we think that's the best team. And what did Michigan actually do?
Not a whole
It
lot.
it beat Penn State, and Penn State's just what it's always been under James Franklin.
It's a better version of Iowa.
Yeah, it's a pretty good team. It's going to beat most of the teams in the Big Ten, but it won't beat Ohio State and Michigan. So Michigan gets huge credit for beating Penn State. I think
despite having 60 passing yards, but apparently that was fine in that game.
Yeah, I just think there are a lot of teams that would beat Penn State. I mean, and I'm not saying it's a bad team, but I'm just not saying it's almost like that game is a showdown. It's like Alabama versus Georgia or Michigan versus Ohio State. I don't see it that way at all, because what keeps happening, Ohio State and Michigan keep beating Penn State. Okay, and then we go to the Ohio State game. Michigan wins that. But does anybody think this Ohio State team was as good as last season's team?
No, and if we're going on most deserving or whatever, I think Michigan's in, right? But if we're doing this purely based on how the committee suddenly claims it picks these four teams, the four best teams, this will be music to your ears again, John. I agree with you. I would have the same four teams. My four best teams right now are Texas. Georgia would be my number 2. We're just going best teams now. We're not rewarding results. Best teams. Georgia, I would have number 2. I would have Alabama 3. Actually, I'd probably have Washington 3, Alabama 4. Although I could be talked out of it and flip those the other way. With Michigan, I'm not convinced, John, that this isn't going to be a repeat of the last couple years. 2 years ago, Michigan beats Ohio State, gets in the playoff, and just get whacked by Georgia in the semifinals. Last year, everybody likes to have the conversation of, well, should TCU have actually been in the playoff? They got destroyed by Georgia in the championship. Well, we conveniently forget TCU beat Michigan in the semifinals. So it's 2 years in a row now. Michigan, beats Ryan Day. They get into the playoffs. And, well, what's happened the last 2 years? They've got bounced in the first round. I don't know. They could be a paper tiger again. I think this is a good matchup for Alabama. I think Alabama can beat Michigan, can get to the national championship. It will feel like vindication toward the committee. I don't really see it as that because, as we said, if it's really about the four best teams, I think they got that wrong too. Georgia should be in the field. But I think this is a matchup Alabama can win. I think we might be heading toward a rematch of Alabama-Texas for the national championship.
Yeah, I think that's very possible. Yeah, you're right about the TCU. That's significant. Everybody said, well, TCU didn't belong in the playoff. Why don't you ask the same thing about Michigan? Maybe Michigan didn't belong in the playoff last season.
Or the year before that when they got picked apart by Georgia in a semifinal.
And so what's so different about this team? I mean, at the start of the year, J.J. McCarthy, Michigan's quarterback, and you can't ignore the quarterback play. Heck, that's why Florida State's not in the playoff. So we're obviously putting a preponderance of significance on quarterbacks. Which quarterback would you rather have in this playoff? You want J.J. McCarthy over Michael Penix of Washington? I don't think so. You want him over Quinn Ewers of Texas? No. Do you want him over Jalen Milroe? No. He's not going to make that shovel pass. No. He's not going to run a 4.40 and just outrun a secondary like Milroe can. And my point is, if you're going to place that much credence on quarterback play, McCarthy was not playing that well down the stretch. And so that to me is significant. That's why I see all these teams. And when we go back to Boo Carnes, which team would you not want to play? Well, of these four, Michigan be the team I wanted to play because
No kidding. Yeah.
yeah, if I can stop that run game, what's Michigan going to do? You have a sort of a better version of Iowa. It's definitely better than Iowa. And it's got a great running back. It's got a great offensive line. It's got a really good defense.
Yeah, I think Penn State's a better version of Iowa. I think Michigan, maybe the better comparison is they're a better version of Penn State. But
Yeah, but I
maybe I'm
just
splitting
think
here.
and we're talking about the Alabama matchup, but I I don't see anybody absolutely shutting Texas down offensively, that offense. And Texas lost a good running back and didn't even skip a beat. It just kept going. Good receivers. I just can't see Michigan hanging with those teams, but I'm sure Alabama is elated. It's almost as though Alabama won twice. It's almost as though it won twice. If Alabama could have picked the team it wanted to play, it would not have picked Texas or Washington. Already lost to Texas. Well, Washington is a high-powered offense, really good running back, really good receivers.
And
I
they got a
just
good defense too.
and it's got an underrated defense, I think. So yeah, if Alabama was picking opponent, they would have thought about it. Maybe Nick Saban would have thought about that for 2 seconds and said, "Well, we'll play Michigan. It's a great team, great tradition, great school, great program, but I think it'll be a great game. It's a
Yeah,
great matchup."
and I think Alabama has kind of embraced this. I don't know if it's quite to the level of like us against the world, but I think they've sort of relished not being the team with the target on their back as much this year. I think they've enjoyed being in that role, and it suits the personality a little bit of this team of being the hunter and not the hunted. They had their backs against the wall. Well, now they're going up against a team that's had the target on their back, both with the number one ranking and then with the situation they're in with the NCAA. And they've had the target on their back for weeks now. And any way you slice it, I think this is kind of an ideal matchup for Alabama. We know our track record picking games probably means Michigan will win by 4 touchdowns, right? But no, truly, I agree with you. I think this is about as good as you could have it if you're Alabama. John, I want to get into a couple of the other New Year's Six. Well, the other 3 New Year's Six games involving SEC teams, just your excitement meter for those games. But first, I've got a column on this coming out this week about the far-fetched possibility that we could have a split national champion back like the old days. You know, the AP, they don't have to award their championship to who wins the college football playoff. Now, that's never happened in the playoff era. You have to go back 2 decades to find the last split national champion. And even if Florida State beats Georgia in the Orange Bowl and does so pretty impressively, I don't think we're going to see a split national championship. However, there's 62 voters in that poll, John. I do think there's a possibility that even though Florida State, they're not going to win an AP national title, I think they could get some first place votes. And so before we move on here, I'm wondering, you've had a ballot in the past. I've had a ballot in the past. You've voted in this multiple times, the AP poll. If you had a ballot this year, without knowing how all the hypotheticals are going to fall, if Florida State were to beat Georgia in the Orange Bowl, would you give much consideration to them as maybe being a number 1 vote, or is that sort of just something we sit around and talk about on podcasts in early December?
No, I would give great consideration to that because my whole thing in voting in the poll was always not what a school's tradition was, not what it's done in the past, not how good it looked in the highlight videos, but who has accomplished the most. And so I would look at that as, again, we're not talking about a playoff. We're talking about voting a team.
Mm-hmm.
If Florida State would have beat Georgia, it held LSU with relative ease in the opener. And LSU is a really good SEC team. Bad defense, but incredible offense. Incredible offense. And Florida State's defense was up to that challenge. And its defense was up to the challenge when it beat Louisville in the ACC championship game. So I would look at, and also would consider the fact a win in the Swamp with your second string quarterback. And see, again, I'm not looking at the, oh my God, it's got a second string quarterback. Oh no, it's got a third string quarterback. We can't put it in the playoff. No, I'm looking, what did it accomplish? This team's so good that it could beat a 10-2 Louisville team with its number 3 quarterback. It's so good that it could beat Florida in a rivalry game in the Swamp. And that was a better version of Florida than what we saw for much of the season. It just was. Those kind of
and the Swamp shows up for Florida State.
Sure. Oh yeah.
Doesn't matter what the record is.
So
they
those are
show
really
up
good wins. And I don't care when it occurred. I mean, some people like to go, well, the teams were just starting. Well, both teams were just starting in early September. I thought LSU was a playoff team. I thought it would be in the college football playoff. I thought it might challenge Georgia, might win the SEC as Alabama turned out winning. So I thought it was great. In Florida State, on a neutral field, how it handled that. So I would look at how it handled LSU. I would look at all that. And yeah, there's a chance I might have voted Florida State a national champion. Because when you look at these teams, this is not a year where I see anybody as a super team. I kind of thought Georgia, maybe Ohio State last year, even though Ohio State lost to Michigan with that quarterback, C.J. Stroud, and all those offensive weapons, man, that was a talented team. And I thought if Georgia's a dominant team, in the year before when Georgia won it starts, that team was even more dominant. You couldn't look at any area of that team and say, well, they're not that good there. They're good everywhere. So I don't see a super team in this playoff field. I mean, you look at the record, look what Alabama, I mean, lucky to beat Auburn. It barely beat Arkansas. Washington played one close game after another in the Pac-12. You break it down. We've already talked about Michigan. So, yeah, I think it would warrant consideration.
I do too, and I'm not saying I would automatically vote for him. I wouldn't. I don't think I would just automatically do it as a protest vote or something, because I took my ballot seriously when I had one. So I wouldn't just log a vote just out of spite. But if it was them versus a one-loss champion, gives you something to think about. Now, if it's like undefeated Washington, and Washington's 15-0. They beat Oregon twice. They go out, win 2 playoff games. I don't know how I'm not voting for, say, 15-0 Washington at that point.
I agree.
Right. But I think there is a certain scenario in which I could see myself voting for Florida State. Now, of course, they have to beat Georgia in the Orange Bowl to even get in that conversation. And that segues us into these New Year's 6 games, John. There's 3 of them that involve SEC teams. You have Georgia, Florida State, in the Orange Bowl, you have Ole Miss, Penn State in the Peach Bowl, and you have Ohio State, Missouri in the Cotton Bowl. I want your 1 to 5 spiciness scale, whatever you want to call it, your chili pepper meter, or I guess the easy version to say this is 1 to 5, how excited are you about these games versus not, which 5 means you're really pretty excited. 1 means that you don't even know whether you've watched. So let's start with, since we've talked so much about Georgia and Florida State, let's start with Georgia, Florida State in the Orange Bowl. 1 to 5, what's your spiciness meter, your level of interest meter there?
Well, you got to keep in mind, I watch just about everything.
I know, especially if it involves a Pac-12 team.
No, so I would look at that game. I would be very curious about it. So I won't give it a 5 because I'm not sure how many guys might opt out. But I'm really curious just to see how both teams will handle being in a secondary bowl. It's New Year's 6, but it's secondary to the playoff. And both of these teams, when the season started, and even when the season ended, they thought, well, we should be in the playoff because for whatever reason, Georgia probably thought we're still the best team, and Florida State would say, look at our record. So that would keep me, I would be very intrigued by that game.
So what are you giving it, a 4, 4.5?
4.5.
4.5? That's a number I had in my mind because of what could be at stake here. Not because Florida State's going to be the AP national champion. We're not trying to push that as a probability, but because they could snag some number one votes and just the controversy that could cause if they were to win, and then vice versa. If Georgia wins, yeah, they didn't get their three-peat, but they bounced back against Alabama, and it makes you kind of wonder what could have been. And I guess I'm just kind of curious too. See, we don't know how many guys will opt out, true, but that Florida State defense, how do they match up against Carson Beck and Georgia's offense? I think it'll be a real test. It'll test the idea of, is Florida State sort of masquerading as a good team in the aftermath of Jordan Travis, or are they still a really, really, really good team that just lost its quarterback and is not quite so good as they once were? So, yeah, I'd give that one 4.5. I'm pretty interested to watch that. How about Ole Miss Penn State in the Peach Bowl? Second New Year's Six appearance in a 3-year span for Ole Miss. Speaks to where that program is under Lane Kiffin and how quickly it got there. Wasn't that long ago when it was fairly irrelevant under Matt Luke. So Penn State, Ole Miss, your excitement meter.
I would say a 5. I love these SEC Big Ten matchups, but I look at this the same way. It's an established a power in Penn State, great tradition in Ole Miss, which was a national powerhouse in the late 50s and early 60s, but it's had some success. And I really like it. It's kind of the stodgy, mundane uniforms of Penn State against all the glitz and glamour of a Lane Kiffin coach team.
Yeah, it really is a contrast here, right? Like James Franklin versus Lane Kiffin.
I keep going. Yeah.
Those white helmets with nothing on them. Penn State versus the Land Sharks or whatever mascot they're calling themselves on a given day from Ole Miss.
I know. It's like, Penn State is a generic college football team. You just
create a team.
Yeah, here it is. No names. So I'm intrigued by that matchup. And I think it's I think because of its Big Ten and SEC, there is a rivalry there. Because you look at it, the network television packages, the rivalry extends to those areas. And it's kind of thought, well, if you end up with two super conferences, that's who you'll have. The SEC, the expanded SEC, and the expanded Big Ten that now goes from coast to coast. So I really like that. I think Penn State has a really good defense, but it hadn't faced an offense like Ole Miss's, and it hadn't faced an offensive coach as creative as Lane Kiffin. So I love that matchup.
And this is kind of a surprise bid for Ole Miss. I mean, they're 10-2 in most years. You would think that almost locks them into a New Year's Six, but it was just a week ago that it was looking really strongly like they'd wind up in the Citrus Bowl against Iowa. But the way some of the dominoes fell on conference championship weekend, the decisions that the selection committee made with the 4 teams that they did, pushed them, reshuffled the chessboard a little bit and wound up with Ole Miss in that New Year's Six. Ole Miss needs to win this game, John, to set a program record for single season victories. They've got 10 before. Of course, they didn't play as many games in the past. They got a 10-1 season, right? Had they ever go undefeated?
Yeah, they did. I think
did?
they were like back in 1960, they were 9-0-1. Back then, you played fewer games. So when you say, well, no Ole Miss's team has ever won 11 games, that doesn't make this the best Ole Miss football team by any stretch of the imagination.
Sure. But it would be the high water mark of the last 50 years.
Yeah, it's kind of post Johnny Vaught. He was a legendary Ole Miss coach. He led it to the very near the top of college football and sustained success there at Ole Miss. But since then, no. I think to have 2 seasons in 3 years like this is quite a compliment of what Lane Kiffin's done.
I don't want to offend our Ole Miss fans. They had 2 undefeated seasons. They won the Sugar Bowl both times. I got the records in front of me here with Johnny Vaught. They won 10 games both times. So yes, it doesn't surpass their greatest seasons, but it would really, I think, kind of reshape the narrative a little bit about Kiffin, because up to this point it's been, yeah, he struggles in the big games, and he did again this year against Georgia and Alabama. It doesn't totally erase that narrative, but a win against Penn State in a bowl game, it massages that narrative a little bit, and it changes the way you remember the season. I think if you're an Ole Miss fan, as 11-2 with a bowl win versus 10-3. I don't go as high as you do on the excitement meter. I'm probably like more like at a 3 level. My only reasoning there is I've seen Penn State a couple times in the big games. Wasn't real impressed. I've seen Ole Miss a couple times in the big games. They didn't rise to the moment. Now, it could be a great game, but I feel like this is sort of the battle for like third or fourth place in the conference. But good game nonetheless. So 3 feels a little low. I'll say 3.5. Last one, John. Ohio State, Missouri in the Cotton Bowl. Missouri fans were a little worried, John, that when they got the New Year's Six, the selection committee was going to say, "Congratulations, Tigers. Enjoy your game against Liberty." Missouri fans wanted a name brand program to culminate this season. Well, they got it, and they got it in the Cotton Bowl. I think Missouri's going to treat this game like it's one of the biggest games in program history. This is going to be their Super Bowl of like the last decade, thereabouts. I don't know if Ohio State will have that that same punch, that same fire in the belly there. But I can tell you, I think Missouri is. This will be their national championship of the last decade, for sure.
Yeah, I've got a 5 by this one. This I like this one even better than the Ole Miss Penn State matchup because of how Ohio State's position as a superpower, all the talent it recruits, and here's Missouri coming out of nowhere. A team I thought would be 6 in the SEC East is now 6 New Year's Six bowl. So I think that has so much to do with bowls. What does this mean to you? I mean,
And we saw what it means to Ohio State to some degree because Kyle McCord is entering the transfer portal.
Well, you can enter the transfer portal and still play.
True.
I mean, he's just maybe lobbying for a pay raise.
True. Could be.
But either way, I mean, if I'm Missouri, Kyle McCord doesn't terrify me. And let's remember, Missouri hung in there with Georgia. That was a good game this year, and I think it can hold its own against Ohio State. And I agree with you. I'm trying to think. Well, it played in the SEC championship games, and there was that Auburn game. I guess it was in 2013 where Auburn won like 55-42 or something crazy score and rushed for about 1,000,000 yards.
Yeah, it was 59-42. You're
Yeah.
right, and that was the first of 2 years back to back. Missouri won the East. That was their better team, where they had James Franklin as their quarterback. They won the East again the next year with Matty Mock as quarterback. But it was that 2013 team that went 12-2. They won Oklahoma. They beat Oklahoma State in the I believe it was the Cotton Bowl then, after losing to Auburn in the SEC championship. So this is their best team since then, and this will probably be their biggest game since those games in that season, I think. Because again, even they won the East the following year, but it wasn't the same team. That was a weaker East. They got trounced by Georgia that year. The 2013 team was a pretty good team.
I think when you look at the coaches too, Eli Drinkwitz has nothing to lose in this game. Nothing. Ryan Day has a lot to lose because he's just lost to Michigan. And now if Ohio State should lose to a program that it would look at as a lightweight, doesn't belong in our realm, I think it would be fans are already dissatisfied with him because he's not beating Michigan. Now, if he loses to Missouri, an SEC program, forget this year overall, a middle of the road SEC program. Bad optics for Ryan Day.
And do you think Elijah Drinkwitz is going to tamp down the celebration just because Kyle McCord is in the transfer portal and a few Buckeyes might opt out? It doesn't.
No.
It doesn't matter how many Buckeyes opt out to prepare for the NFL or head off to the portal or whatever. There's going to be no tamping down of Missouri's celebration if they were to win.
Well, yeah, he will make this Ohio State team out to be one of the greatest teams of all times, regardless who takes the field.
All right, so you're excited about all these
Yes.
New Year's 6 games. Probably the only thing that could excite you more, John, is maybe if Oregon State was in one of these games or something. I know you like those the Beavers.
Yeah. And I was certainly wrong about Oregon. I'd really kind of jumped on that Oregon bandwagon, and I'm off it now.
It's one thing about you. You don't stay on past your welcome there. You're hopping off those bandwagons.
See ya.
Yeah. We have no picks this week, John, but I know our listeners were plugged into that contest. So the final regular season standings, I went 4-2 last week, John. You were 2-4. I wrestled away the regular season title for you. I finished 38-42-1. You were 36-43-2. However, the playoff committee has told us, John, regular season results don't matter. None of what you saw just mattered. It wouldn't have mattered if we went undefeated or not. We're not the champs. We're just a couple of losers, but we can wipe the slate clean. We'll do it again for the postseason.
And the way I look at it, I'm still the best picker.
You can crown yourself whatever you want.
Get myself a ring.
It's a modern world. Thanks for listening to this edition of SEC Football Unfiltered.